If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of If This Goes On, Don't Panic. In this episode, I interview Tobias Buckell on a number of topics including Cli-Fi, solar punk, and how his life inspires his fiction. This episode is an outlier in some ways. This interview was recorded at Confluence in 2019. Confluence is a Pittsburgh con that usually takes place in July. So this interview is a little bit out of time. What happened is that I scheduled this interview before my old podcast, Alan and Jeremy vs. Science Fiction, was ending. But I didn't interview him until after it had ended. Also, at the same time, Kat and I had started discussing this new podcast, but we hadn't taken any steps to realize it. We actually started to do that later in the same day that I did this interview at the same con. As you listen to the episode, you'll note that Kat and Chris Snyder, the sometimes editor of Alan and Jeremy vs. Science Fiction, and the music composer of this podcast, are hanging out in the background. I was torn as to whether I should release this on the old podcast or here, but after a little bit of thought, I realized that this is really the first recording for this podcast. I think after you listen to the interview, you'll see what I mean. I also decided to put this episode second and not first because I wanted the first episode of the podcast to introduce everybody to Hope Punk, since a lot of our philosophy is really kind of based off of that idea as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks for listening. All right, so this is Alan. I am here at Confluence, our Pittsburgh-based con. This is my second year coming here. I didn't record anything last year, though. You could probably tell my voice is still crazy from ReaderCon. And so please just bear with me. I am also here with Tobias Buckell.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming on. I'm here with Kat Ramba.
Hello.
And Chris is also lurking here in the background.
I'm lurk and learn, right?
He's lurking and learning. So Tobias, I just learned the other day that Confluence was the first con that you ever went to.
Yes, back in 2000, this was the first convention I ever attended. A local area writer, her name was Tamala, invited me to come out after I published my very first short story. So this is 19 years later, I get to come back as a guest of honor. It's all full circle of everything. Very nice.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, Confluence is, you could easily describe it as a small con. Mm-hmm. Having been to the Nebulas and now ReaderCon, I know what bigger cons look like. And so it's kind of funny that this was your first one.
It seemed big and intimidating at the time.
Yeah, I know when I came last year for the first time, it was weird. The Nebulas in 2018 were my first ever con. Mm-hmm. And then this last year was my second one. I was like, the differences are just crazy. And I didn't know anybody. Now I've met all the local people, so I can come in. And it's more like a family gathering kind of a thing,
Yeah.
So Kat tells me something about a bathtub or how if I meet you in a bathtub.
There's a story about a bathtub. The bathtub story was we ran into someone who remembered meeting me over a bathtub full of ice, so I had to explain the whole story. No organs were taken during this story.
That's going to be my next question.
I have all my organs, everything's intact, but I think it was at Boston Worldcon back in 2004, 2005, somewhere thereabouts. I was just starting my career as a writer. I was a baby writer. One of the friends I had made recently was a writer by the name of Carl Schrader. He's a great, extraordinarily imaginative science fiction writer and futurist based out of Toronto, Canada. And when I went to this Worldcon, I went to one of these Tor parties, which the publisher Tor holds. And at the time, I was a baby Tor author. I just sold my first book to them. So I went to the Tor party, and it was packed and hot and miserable. Just, 100 and some odd people cramped into a small hotel suite, and I was feeling a bit unhappy with how tight, crowded, and hot it was. And my buddy Carl Schrader sort of came across the room and grabbed my cuff and pulled me into the bathroom. And in the bathroom, it was the bathtub had been filled with ice, and cans of soda had been put in there to create, like a quick igloo. And it was nice and cool because the air was coming across the ice of the bathtub, and there were a couple places to sit, so we didn't have to stand. And I ended up spending 5 hours sitting in the bathroom talking to Carl and another author by the name of Scott Westerfeld about lighter than air travel and all the science fiction geeky things that you as a writer get to talk with. And as people would come into the bathroom looking for a beer, we would ask them what they wanted, and we'd find the coldest one, root through and hand it to them and have them leave the bathroom so we could continue our conversation. What was also great is that as random people that we knew and wanted to talk to circled into the bathroom, we would just sort of detain them and add someone to the conversation. So it's one of my fondest memories of a Worldcon ever was that night. And one of the people who'd been a part of that conversation, who'd cycled in for a part of that conversation, met me here and said, "You may not remember me, but I remember talking to you in a bathtub at a conference." He couldn't quite remember the full details. And I was like, "I know what you're talking about." And it was a bathtub full of ice at a Worldcon. And he was like, "Yes, that's it." So,
funny.
So we were able to reminisce about meeting, 15 odd years ago in the bathroom at a Worldcon. And it was a tremendous amount of fun.
The impromptu bartenders, it sounds like.
That's what we turned into. And everyone that I wanted to meet, all of my friends and colleagues that I wanted to meet at that convention, I met that night in the bathroom.
That's awesome. I always like to hear the con stories. A lot of times when I go to a con and I do these little live interviews, which is not our normal format. I do this once or twice a year. And I always like to hear about, how did you get involved in cons and what does this con mean to you and that sort of thing. So I'm glad that you have those stories, and I'm glad that Kat posted those on Twitter so that I could see them.
A lot of confused people on Twitter when you're like, Toby, my favorite Confluence story so far has been Toby talking about meeting people in a bathtub.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
That's what Twitter is for, to kind of throw out these enigmatic things and see who bites.
Yeah, exactly. So I would talk about your work just a little bit. I think you'd be considered a Cli-Fi writer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean,
some of your work. Anyway.
I've written some climate change fiction. I think of them as eco thrillers.
Oh, okay. I've not heard that one yet. So one thing that we've been talking about on the podcast a lot, and I think in science fiction a lot, is solar punk.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel that your work fits in with solar punk?
So I haven't looked tremendously close at the Solar Punk Manifesto, but I think it's like optimistic futures and grappling with that. So Arctic Rising was the first of these two novels that I did that kind of grapples with climate change in this sort of 50-year out sort of time span. And what I was trying to do with those books is not be dystopic, but not be unrealistic. From everything I've read from IPCC documents, as well as what I've read from or listened to when I've been attending scientific presentations, there's a certain amount of misunderstanding among the general population about like how much we can roll back the damage that's already been done. And as far as I can tell, the scientific community is not even talking about rolling back. The radical changes that they're saying we have 12 years to make are just to hold the line where it is with the damage that's already been done baked in. So there's no chance that we ever end up having the ice back in the north. The polar ice cap is going to die, so we have to deal with an eighth ocean, and that's kind of the genesis of the novel. Is looking at yes, we will make tremendous leaps forward with battery technology. Yes, there's amazing things happening with solar power. There are all of these mitigation adaptation things that we're going to be doing that we're already on the road to do. There have been some tremendous leaps forward, but there's a certain amount of damage that's already built into the system that we can't just magically undo. It doesn't matter how many trees we plant. It doesn't matter what we do. We've dumped enough heat into the ocean. The ocean is actually a very slowly recovering system.
Yeah.
We've dumped so much heat into the ocean that it's going to take a certain amount of time to recover. There's ocean acidification. There's a loss of species. There's a loss of insect species. There's just a loss of so much that we don't bounce back from that. And so this was trying to write sort of like a level-headed, clear-headed, like here's not a best case scenario, but a likely scenario.
Right.
And so it's interesting to me that some people like bounce off of it as too dystopian. And it's interesting that some people are like, oh, this is like solar punk. You're way too hopeful. I was trying to split the difference and say that, if we get our act together and do all the things right, we might enjoy seeing something that looks like this as we muddle through. Yeah. And that's what those books were. So I don't know where that fits within the solar punk kind of manifesto, but it's kind of on the periphery if you think. But it's not all doom and gloom. I'm not ready to, I'm not trying to write a dystopia where everything is completely screwed. I do that in short fiction.
We have an episode about solar punk coming out. It'll be out in October for listeners. And we interviewed Serena Ulibarri. Are you familiar with her?
I'm not.
Okay. Well, we actually considered one of your stories. I think it was the one. Okay, so they like get on this RV thing, and it goes through time to like the different dimensions, to different.
A world to die for.
A world to die for. That's it. Yes.
Each alternate reality that they go to is based on a different, amount of global warming and what people have done.
Cool.
Yes. And so it's kind of like sliders with IPCC target levels.
Yes.
And
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it was just a way to dramatize. The whole story came out of the fact that a scientist actually challenged me to dramatize the different climate. I think they're called RPC scenarios, or I talk about it in the story, but on the spot, my brain is a complete fuzz. But it was a way to dramatize the different scenarios that they've laid out as like, if we dump this much carbon into the atmosphere, this will be what the future looks like, and if we dump this much, this is what it looks like. And each of those has a different number assigned to it so that they can talk about them when they're talking about like, oh, if we cut this much carbon, then this is the kind of level. So I just was like, okay, how do we dramatize that? And it was really interesting to me that so many of the reviews of it were people arguing about climate change rather than looking at the story itself. People felt really compelled to sort of just like be like, and instead of just being like, oh, this is a fun and imaginative ride, it's just like, rah, climate change. So it got under people's skin, and I like that.
No, it totally did. I mean, I remember reading it, and I think I even tweeted to you, like, I just read this story, and holy hell, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure how depressed I should be. I'm definitely feeling depressed, But I loved it. It was a great story.
It also allowed me to do one of my favorite things, and I've been wanting to do it forever, which is that every time I look at a Mad Max kind of scenario where people are like,
oh my gosh,
in the future, like we'll be driving these like, Mopar, cobbled together cars with like, V8 engines across like the, destroyed landscape of our future. And I'm like, no, it'll all be like freaking Priuses with horns mounted on the front. Because you'll want the most fuel efficient car you can get after the apocalypse, right? We'll be killing each other over solar panels that are left over, trying to like trickle charge our Teslas that you've like, murdered someone for, because it makes no sense to have a gas vehicle after the apocalypse. Like there's just no infrastructure for it. We've dug all the oil wells that are easy to dig. So if there's any collapse in our technological ability or economic ability even, like that just all goes away. It's and this for a fact because you can see what happened in Cuba after the Russians collapsed. And so Cuba, because it's economically isolated from all the countries in the world, they get a lot of their oil from Venezuela or Russia. So when the Russian collapse happened from communism and to capitalism, all the cheap oil that they provided to Cuba with went away, and they had they had an oil crisis on the island. And so what you see is old cars being pulled by oxen or donkeys, right? So it's like, no, you don't get Mad Max. You get a Prius with like, longhorn steer, horns strapped onto the front, which is what I did for the opening of that.
And the Mad Max reference is hilarious. That Serena Ulibarri said the exact same thing. She's like, this is Mad Max through dimensions about climate change. So that was her description.
Oh, cool.
Hey, you all know that I'm a supporter of Dreamforge magazine. You might wonder why you should support Dreamforge too. First, understand that Dreamforge is a new kind of science fiction and fantasy magazine that is looking for hopeful futures in a time when it seems hard to find that. Second, check out their magazine. The illustrations are beautiful. Personally, I was very impressed by the cover of the 3rd issue. Additionally, they have top-tier talent writing in the magazine, like Jane Linskold, Dave Weber, and Mary Soon Lee. They also have new authors to discover too. And if you're like me and read a lot on the bus, they have a portal set up for you so you can read the magazine on your phone or tablet. There are plenty of other reasons to check them out too. You can find them at dreamforgemagazine.com. That's DreamForgemagazine.com. So that's a pretty good segue talking about Cuba. I wanted to ask you, being a Caribbean author, how does that fuel your fiction in general, but also in regards to the whole Cli-Fi thing?
Sure. So, I mean, in general, I grew up in the Caribbean. I'm Grenadian. I was born in Grenada, so I've got the ability to have 3 passports. I have the right to a Grenadian passport. I have a UK passport because I was born in Grenada the year it declared independence.
Oh, interesting.
And my mom's British. And I've been in the U.S. long enough that I have the right to apply for a U.S. passport. So I'm kind of this sort of interesting fellow. In the guest of honor speech, I talked about the fact that I am an immigrant, and proud of it. To be an immigrant is a big part of my identity. So that infuses a lot of my fiction. Growing up in a small island that is independent, but charting its course through a vast and powerful turbulent world. You see that pop up a lot in my fiction. There's a lot of sort of Caribbean post-colonial concerns, even before I even knew that word. I think Jay Lake, rest in power, was one of the first people who at a panel once turned to me and said, "Oh, he's a post-colonial, science fiction writer." And I remember sitting there going like, "Oh my gosh, he's right. That's perfect." So that infuses a lot of my work. The fact that I am, biracial infuses a lot of my work. I'm trying to bring more diversity, and I grew up in a very a diverse environment, and so when I got writing science fiction, I brought a lot of that to the fiction back in the 2000s. And in terms of the climate change stuff, I'm a climate change refugee as well. Yeah. I was living in the Virgin Islands when we got hit with 3 really horrible hurricanes, the likes of which haven't been seen until last year when we had the really bad ones come through. And that gave me a strong appreciation for how vulnerable the islands are as a result of all the heat that's being dumped into the atmosphere. That's why I ended up living in the Midwest. We didn't have a home to go back to. So we had to relocate to my stepdad's parents' place because there was total destruction on the island and we lost the boat we lived on. So that is kind of like personal and built in. And so in Hurricane Fever, the novel that follows Arctic Rising, it's all about megastorms and climate change adaptation and things like that in the Caribbean. And I remember when I first started going down to the Caribbean literary conferences, and I was like, I want to talk about like climate adaptation. People were a little bit like, there's really nowhere to sit you for that. That's not a literary thing. That's like a scientific conference thing. But after last year's hurricanes, I was back, the hurricanes recently, I was back down right after that. And what were all the panels? It was like climate change, resilience, and adaptation for the Caribbean from a literary and artistic perspective. Like, what can we do as artists to deal with this? And I was just like, yes, this is what's been kind of like consuming me for a while. Unfortunately, I didn't get to be on any of those panels, but I was like, I wrote a whole book about it. It's Hurricane Fever. These things kind of definitely lace throughout a lot of the fiction.
Sure. So I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know you're super busy being guest of honor and they keep you running around. So what gives you hope these days, going through all of that stuff and then understanding our current political climate and everything that is going on? What gives you hope to keep going? That's not good.
I'm like a little oppositional defiant. What gives me hope is just to like hang in there long enough to piss on certain people's graves. And people think I'm joking, but I'm like not. I'm there to see it through at this point, and it's just it's a marathon. Yeah. What gives me hope? What gives me hope is that many years ago in California, there's a writer online who writes about this, and he calls it the Californication of America. I think was the title of what he wrote. And I was really glad to see the article, and I passed it around to a few friends because I was like working on this theory myself, and this person did it way better. So then I didn't have to write the damn thing. I could just forward it to people. And his theory was like, and he pointed out that in the 1990s, California did something kind of similar to what the country just did, which was that California, even though it had a reputation for being kind of liberal, was really contained in San Francisco and parts of LA, but most of the vast rest of it was just like the rest of the country. It was a purple state. People were all over. In the 90s, they elected people who said that they were going to get rid of all the immigrants in California and enact legislation to act on that. Yeah. It's something we've kind of forgotten, but like California went through this sort of reactionary period, and they actually started passing laws and doing the thing. They devastated their farming economy. They devastated chunks of some other economies. They unleashed racial tension and hatred, and the blowback to that was generational and profound. It took a while, but it was inexorable. And what ended up happening as a result of that is California, as we know it today, where the entire state has become aligned to a whole set of values. So, people saw what those policies that had previously been only talked about looked like when they were enacted, and they decided that that was profoundly antithetical to their values as Americans. My hope is that we're going through a similar process, which is that in theory, people have been hearing about these things, that if we put our people in charge who believe this, this, and this, that they're going to create this nicer society that has our values. And now we're seeing what their values look like when they're enacted in real time. Yeah. And I think a lot of people are going to have a reaction to that. My hope is that we do the same thing as happened in California. And you can see that what happened in California was a profound reorganization and the self-destruction of the party that did what it did. Yeah. They slit their own throats, and they made themselves pretty meaningless in California politics. Yeah. So the writer of this says that like California is always like 20 years ahead of the rest of the country, was their argument. 20 to 30 years ahead, right? And so like we're just trailing along, and now we've decided that we're going to have our reactionary period and do the same exact thing as California did in the 90s. Of course, there's no perfect analogy, but I'm not sure if that, I hate to go on record on a podcast as saying that maybe this is what the country's going through. I said in my guest of honor speech that when I first arrived here in the 90s, 52% of Americans believed that mixed race marriages were problematic and that people like me, someone who's biracial, just shouldn't even exist. And only 48% kind of approved of my right to exist. And that was when I dropped on these shores in 96. That's what the Gallup poll took a look at and got back. Now it is the last time they pinged for this question was in 2014. And it was 87% of Americans were okay with someone like me existing, and 13% that just were horrifically opposed to it, right? So I think that like when I talk about this, is I think that there's fundamentally when 87% of your population isn't rabidly racist, that means that like some of them have gone along with this because they're worried about abortion, they're worried about their religious values, they've been told certain things. And now they're seeing what their allies are interested in doing. That 17%, that reactionary 17%, they're getting a taste of what that really is. And so my hope is that they reject it. They reject children in cages, that they reject concentration camps, that they reject ethnic cleansing, and that the reaction that we're seeing with people protesting, with people resisting, with people constantly talking about it. My hope is that, we do Californication ourselves. Awesome. We California ourselves, because what's the alternative? Yeah. Right. The alternative is Nazi Germany. Right. These are the two paths we have in front of us. We're either going to go become more liberal as a result, of this period, or we're going to become more authoritarian. There is no like we go back to being the way we were 3 years ago.
Right.
And interestingly enough, I'm seeing this in stuff like, people on Facebook who I'm friends with and stuff like that. People who were always that sort of milquetoast, middle of the road kind of person, where they were like, oh, I love the idea of all the races getting along in theory, but they don't really do much about it at all.
Yeah.
But as a result of the current atmosphere now, they're suddenly like having to choose between resist or tacitly approve.
Right.
And so you're seeing people who never said anything political or went to protests or anything like that suddenly activating, and once you've done that, you kind of cross this mental leap. I'm seeing people go to protests that were never political 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I mean, I can tell you, I never called a sitting congressperson prior to the election.
Yeah.
I'd never manned the phones. I did not sign up to go help people vote and all that stuff, right? So even though I was writing about stuff and kind of active, I wasn't active on that level until this happened, and I'm not going to stop. It's baked into me now to want to have a voice in this stuff now and be heard. And so I think that's where the seeds of hope are.
Awesome. Great answer. Thank you.
It's lovely.
So what are you working on now? What's coming up for you?
I have a project that I have not actually technically sold, but I'm in the process of selling. So I can't talk about that, but it will be cool and awesome. And just stay tuned, right?
So cool.
It'll be so cool. But I have 2 fantasy novels that my agent will at some point be taking out.
Nice.
I wrote a novel with Dave Kletcher that's kind of like Marines go to Middle Earth and chaos ensues. Kind of a classic Portal fantasy. And the other one is this novel I wrote, a fantasy novel about gods that have fallen to Earth, and we're mining them for their magic.
Okay.
So you kind of get like a couple ounces of god blood, and you can go like snort that and cast a spell.
Oh, that's awesome.
That vaguely reminds me of James Morrow's book, Godhead.
Not Tome Jehovah.
Yes, Tome Jehovah.
Yes.
What a crazy ass book.
That's a fantastic novel. Yeah. So it's kind of like doing high fantasy with, dealing with some of those things of like gods become corporeal. What do you do with it? Well, you mine the heck out of it and sell the parts, because that's
good capitalist system.
Good capitalist system.
Right.
So yeah, I've been playing with some of that, and that was a fun novel to write. And of course, lots of short stories. If anyone's really interested, I have a Patreon, and I write a short story a month. You can subscribe for as little as $1 a month, and that's always fun. And there are like 22 or 23 stories up there now. So for $1, you could read 24 stories right away. And
that's awesome.
That's been a lot of fun. And yeah, I think that's everything.
Awesome. And I can tell you, I read the hell out of The Zen of Starship Maintenance.
Thank you.
I've read that 3-4 times. I usually don't reread short stories
Thank you.
frequently, but that one I read 3 or 4 times. Loved it. But thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it, and spending your time with us. And I look forward to talking to you later.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before I go, I'd like to add a few quick book reviews since we didn't do any during the interview. So here we go. The Widening Gyre by Michael R. Johnston, published in 2019 by Flametree Press. This is the first novel in what will be the Remembrance War series. So what happens is, 800 years ago, the remnants of the human race was saved by some aliens. This novel follows a daring space jockey as he stumbles across the secret past of the human race. It's a fun novel that harkens back to the pulps without indulging too deeply. It kind of reminds me of Star Wars without the Jedi. Like, if everything just followed around a gay Han Solo as he battled his way from one sticky situation to his next, and always with some kind of clever response to the situation. Like Han Solo. Anyone who prefers the X-Wing scenes from Star Wars to the Jedi stuff should definitely check this one out. And the second book I want to talk about is Sunspot Jungle Volume 1, edited by Bill Campbell, published by Rosarium Publishing, and this was also published in 2019. This is a fantastic anthology. I would definitely give it 5 stars out of 5. It's one of the best anthologies I've read in a long time, and I read a lot of them. It's a huge collection, probably around 40 stories, in an extremely diverse set of authors. And here's just a few that I wrote down. Malka Older, N.K. Jemisin, Saladin Ahmed, Victor Lavelle, Francesco Verso, Maurice Bratis, John Chu, Rose Lemberg, and Charlie Jane Anders. And that is just a few from a huge list. And the stories themselves are just as diverse, including everything from a satire about gun control by Jeffrey Ford, to ghost stories, to surrealist pieces, to magic realism. I mean, there's something for everyone in this collection. Take some time to support Rosarium Publishing and check this one out. All right, and that's it for the book reviews. I just want to say thanks to Tobias for spending some time discussing stories with us. And thanks to all you out there for listening. And don't forget to share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. If you've been wondering how else you could support us, hopefully by the time this comes out, our Patreon will be set up. Please check that out. We'd appreciate the help if you're able to contribute. And we have multiple tiers you can choose, of course. So goodbye, and we'll see you next time. This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited by Alan Bailey with production by Rachel Renee. The theme music is by Father Flamethrower and Sable Aradia, with additional music by Christopher Snydrosky. The intro is by Dave Robinson. Special thanks to our guest, Tobias Buckell. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.